There are moments in life that feel completely ordinary right up until they aren't. And sometimes, the moments that change everything don't announce themselves. They arrive quietly, in a bedroom, in a driveway, in the space where something used to be. Nancy Guthrie's bedroom holds a story she never planned on sharing. The kind of story that exists behind closed doors, in the soft, private corners of a life that looked completely fine from the outside. The kind where what people see in public and what actually lives in private are two entirely different things. And then there's Annie, a woman who walked out her front door one ordinary morning, looked toward where her car should have been, and found nothing. Not stolen, not sold, impounded, sitting somewhere in a lot, while she stood in her driveway trying to understand how a decision she never made had somehow produced consequences. She couldn't afford these. Two stories seem like they have nothing to do with each other. Different women, different problems, different kinds of pain. But pull at the threads long enough and something starts to appear. Something they share that goes deeper than the surface details. Both of these women were living lives that looked stable, until something reached in from the outside, or surfaced from within, and rearranged everything without asking. Both of them found themselves standing in territory they hadn't prepared for. Both of them had to figure out what you do when the version of your life you thought was solid starts showing you it wasn't quite as solid as you believed. What was really happening inside Nancy's bedroom? What did that room actually reveal about the life she was living? And why was Annie's car taken? Who had the authority to do that? And what happened when she refused to simply accept it? The answers to those questions are stranger and sadder, and more human than the surface version suggests. Stay with this. Some stories don't begin in crisis. That's actually what makes them harder to talk about. They begin in the quiet, in the unremarkable rhythm of a life that seems to be running the way it's supposed to. They begin in places most people walk past without a second thought. A familiar street, a driveway at dusk, a morning that feels the same as every morning before it. That's where Nancy Guthrie's story begins. Not in chaos, not in some visible unraveling, but in the kind of stillness that settles over a life just before something in it shifts. Nancy had built something that, from the outside, looked grounded. She had a home, a routine, a sense of order that gave her days their shape and structure. People who knew her have described her as composed, as someone who kept things together quietly, who managed whatever she was managing without making it visible, without asking to be seen. There's a particular kind of person who moves through the world that way, who holds their interior life with both hands and never sets it down in public. Nancy was that kind of person, and her bedroom was where that interior life actually lived. A bedroom is different from every other room in a house. It's the one space where a person doesn't have to perform, where things get kept not because they're presentable but because they matter. The objects that stay close, the things that don't get thrown away. The way a space organizes itself around a real life instead of the life someone shows to the world. What was found in Nancy's room, or what was noticed about it, became a conversation that grew much further than she ever intended or anticipated. Annie's story has a different texture entirely, where Nancy's disruption rose slowly from the inside. Annie's arrived from the outside without warning, sudden, bureaucratic, the kind of problem that doesn't come with a letter or a phone call or any kind of courtesy. It comes as an absence, the absence of something you depended on, something you assumed would simply be there because it always had been. A car is not just a car for most people. It's the difference between getting to work and not, between keeping a job and watching it slip away, between moving through your own life on your own terms and waiting on other people to allow it. When Annie's car disappeared from where she left it, the loss wasn't just practical. It landed somewhere deeper than that. It made her ask how something like this could happen, and more urgently, whether anyone was going to help her fix it. To women, separate circumstances, different chapters, but both of them, at the same point in their lives, were standing at the edge of something, at the place where things have already changed and you don't fully know it yet. The place where what comes next is still unclear, and the life you had before is already starting to look different in the rear view. Nancy Guthrie was not someone who invited attention. That matters more than it might seem at first. Because the people who end up being talked about are so often the ones who never expected it. The quiet ones. The ones whose lives, from any reasonable distance, looked unremarkable in the best possible sense. She had lived in her home long enough for it to become part of her. Not through anything grand, just through time. Through the way familiarity settles into a place. Through knowing which parts of it creak and which parts of it breathe, and where the afternoon light falls and for how long. Homes like that don't just hold people. They hold history, and sometimes they hold things that tell a more complicated story than the one being lived out loud. Her bedroom, according to those who became aware of its contents, was not what people expected. Not because it was extreme in any obvious way, but because it was revealing in the quiet, specific way that private spaces always are. The accumulation of choices, the things kept and the things let go. The way a room shapes itself around the actual contours of a person's life. Not the version they present, but the version they actually inhabit when no one is watching. What drew attention to it, according to reports that later began to circulate, wasn't anything illegal, wasn't anything immediately alarming. It was the kind of detail that makes people pause without fully knowing why. That leaves a small, persistent question sitting in the back of the mind long after the moment has passed. People who were close to Nancy have described a woman who was managing a great deal, more than she showed, responsibilities that weren't always visible, pressures that didn't have obvious places to land, the kind of quiet internal weight that accumulates over time in a person who doesn't make a habit of setting it down. Her bedroom, in that sense, reflected something about her that her public face didn't. The layers, the depth of what was being held beneath the surface. What exactly was she managing? What did that room actually hold, and what did it mean? Those questions began pulling in more attention than Nancy had ever wanted, anywhere near her private life. Meanwhile, Annie's days at the same point had their own steadiness, her own familiar rhythm. Her car sat in her driveway every night, reliable, ready. She didn't think about it the way people only start thinking about things once they're gone. That steadiness, for both of these women, in their completely separate lives, was already in the process of ending. Annie didn't know her car had been impounded until she needed it. That's the specific cruelty of how these situations tend to arrive. Not with a warning, not with time to prepare. You walk out your front door on a regular morning, you glance toward where your car has always been, and it isn't there. The space where it was is just empty space now. And for a moment, the mind refuses to catch up. There's a physical quality to that disbelief, a kind of stillness in the body while the brain tries to process what the eyes are actually reporting. According to reports surrounding her situation, the impoundment was connected to a legal matter that Annie disputed. The specifics involved questions about ownership, about documentation, and about decisions that had apparently been made without her knowledge or her consent. This kind of situation is not as rare as it should be. Cases where the paperwork trail and the lived reality of who actually depends on something, who pays for it, who uses it every single day, end up pointing in completely different directions. The system, in circumstances like these, doesn't tend to account for lived reality. It accounts for what's on the documents, and the documents don't always tell the full story. Annie started making calls. She contacted the impound lot. She asked questions. What she heard back didn't line up with her understanding of her own situation. She was given phone numbers. Those numbers led to other numbers, other departments, other people who told her to try somewhere else. The kind of loop that feels, even when it isn't intentional, designed to outlast people, designed to make the effort of fighting back cost more than the thing being fought for. She didn't stop. What she discovered as she kept pushing was that the situation was more entangled than it had first appeared. There were claims being made by parties she hadn't expected to be involved. There were questions surfacing about whether the impoundment had even been authorized through proper channels. For Nancy, disruption was arriving in a quieter form, through the slow, unsettling process of realizing that the private world she had carefully maintained was beginning to become visible, not through any single dramatic event, but through the gradual, unavoidable way that private things have of eventually surfacing. Someone had noticed what was inside Nancy's bedroom, and once something like that gets noticed, it cannot be unnoticed. The more Annie dug, The more she found, she learned that the vehicle had been impounded following a legal filing. She sought legal guidance. She spoke to people who knew the process. And what emerged from those conversations, according to her account, was not the picture of a simple administrative mistake. It was something more complicated. Competing claims, unresolved questions about what had been agreed to and when, documents pointing one direction and circumstances pointing another. The impound lot kept the car. Every day that passed added more fees. Every additional day made the situation incrementally harder to undo. That's one of the less visible ways systems like this cause harm, not through one defining act, but through the steady, grinding accumulation of time and cost until the original wrong becomes almost beside the point. Nancy's story was deepening simultaneously, in its own quieter register. What the people around her were beginning to understand was that what mattered about her bedroom wasn't necessarily any single specific thing inside it. What mattered was what the room as a whole suggested, about her state of mind, about her circumstances, about the life she had been navigating largely on her own. People close to her have described a woman who was holding herself together through a kind of sustained, silent effort, who had maintained an appearance of stability while carrying internal pressures that didn't have obvious places to go. Her bedroom, looked at in that light, wasn't evidence of something gone wrong. It was a reflection of something being held together by a sheer, quiet will. But things held together only by will, without support, without relief, without anyone fully seeing the weight, can only hold for so long. There's a particular moment in stories like these when the surface version of events gives way to something more honest underneath. For Annie, that moment came when she shifted her focus, when she stopped asking only how to get her car back and started asking the larger question of why the situation had ever been allowed to reach this point at all. Why the processes that should have been working in her favor, as the person who used the vehicle, who paid for it, who needed it to function in her daily life, had instead moved against her without her knowledge, without her input, without any apparent concern for what it would cost her. What she uncovered, according to her account, and those who followed the situation, was a pattern of procedural failures, not necessarily the result of deliberate malice, but damaging in their effect regardless of intent. Communications that hadn't reached her, filings she had never been notified about, a timeline of events that, when laid out plainly, raised genuine questions about whether the impoundment had been carried out in accordance with proper procedure. She raised those questions formally. She put them in writing, and the responses she received were not the clear, straightforward answers the questions deserved. No official conclusion had been reached at the time these events were being discussed publicly. But the questions didn't go away. They stayed exactly where she'd placed them. Waiting, Nancy's truth was arriving in a different form, quieter, in some ways harder to articulate, because it didn't fit into the cleaner categories of right and wrong, authorized and unauthorized. What the people who cared about her were slowly beginning to understand was that her bedroom had become two things at once, a sanctuary and a weight, the place where she was most fully herself, where she kept what mattered, where she could set down the version of herself she carried out into the world, and simply exist without performing. And what that room held, the details that had drawn outside attention, spoke to a woman in the middle of navigating something deeply personal, something that had never been anyone else's business, but something that, once it entered a wider conversation, quietly changed the way people understood her. She hadn't invited that. She hadn't prepared for it, and the way it affected her was something the people closest to her found genuinely hard to witness. By the time both of these situations had reached whatever form of resolution they were going to reach, and neither of them arrived at anything clean or final, the women at the center of them had been changed in ways that resist easy measurement. Annie had spent weeks inside a system that was not built with her situation in mind. She had spent money she hadn't budgeted for. She had spent emotional energy that doesn't simply return when the crisis passes. Progress had been made. Certain concerns had been formally acknowledged. Certain procedural questions had been put on record. But her car had remained in that impound lot far longer than any fair reading of her situation would justify. What she carried out of that, Experience extended beyond the practical, beyond the lesson about documentation and what to never assume is handled. She carried something more interior than that, a new kind of wariness, a first-hand understanding of how fast an ordinary life can be disrupted by processes that operate entirely without your permission. But she also carried something else, a quiet determination that didn't need to announce itself, the kind that doesn't look like strength from the outside but absolutely is. Nancy's situation had moved through its most intense period. The attention that had found her private world, the scrutiny, the observations, the questions that arose from what people had noticed, had passed through its peak. She had navigated the specific discomfort of being seen more completely than she had ever chosen to be, with the composure that had always defined her in other people's eyes. She had moved through that exposure without dissolving, but something in her had recalibrated. The people who knew her noticed it, even if they struggled to name it exactly. A drawing inward, a greater deliberateness about what she offered and to whom, as if the experience of having her private life observed had made the walls around it a little more considered, a little more intentional. That response is not unusual. It is, in fact, one of the most recognizable things about being human. When something private becomes public, even briefly, even partially, it leaves a mark. Not always in the visible ways, not always in the dramatic ways, but in the subtler texture of how a person moves, what they choose to share, where they decide to keep their boundaries. Both of these women had lived through a version of that, a moment where something they held privately had entered a conversation larger than themselves, and both of them, in their own separate ways, had had to decide what to do with what that cost them. It would be easy to reduce these stories to their most dramatic surfaces: the bedroom, the impounded car, the disputes and the unanswered questions. Easy to treat them as interesting details rather than as windows into something that actually matters. But that reduction misses the part that is worth staying for. What these stories are really about is the pressure that ordinary life exerts on ordinary people. The way most of us are carrying things, real things, heavy things that the people around us don't fully see or know about. The way systems that are designed to function without bias can land on individual people in ways that feel anything but neutral. The way the private spaces we build and maintain hold versions of ourselves that our public faces never show. Nancy was a woman managing more than she let on. That is not a criticism. It is one of the most recognizable human experiences there is, if people are willing to be honest about it. The question of whether those around her understood what she was carrying before all of this happened, before her private world became visible, doesn't have a satisfying answer. Annie was a woman who had to fight for something that should never have required a fight. And the part of her story that deserves the most weight is not the car itself. It is that she kept asking questions, that she documented, that she refused to let exhaustion do what the system was apparently counting on it to do. These are not famous people. They are not public figures whose lives play out on stages built for observation. They are people whose stories surfaced because circumstance pushed them into a visibility they hadn't sought. And there is something in that visibility, in what emerged, in what was raised and left unanswered, that asks something of anyone paying attention. It asks us to look a little more carefully at the lives being lived quietly in our immediate proximity. There are bedrooms in every home where someone is carrying something no one else has been invited to see. There are cars sitting in impound lots somewhere right now while the people who need them are caught inside systems that don't particularly care about the human cost. There are private truths holding themselves in steady tension with public surfaces everywhere. Every day, belonging to people whose names we will never know. That is not a comfortable thing to sit with, but it is an honest one. And the honest version of a story, even when it's harder, is always where something real lives. If something in this stayed with you, if it brought up a thought or a feeling or a question you want to put into words, the comments are there for that. This channel is built around stories told this way, carefully, at a pace that lets them breathe. If that's what you're looking for, subscribe. There's more here that's worth your time.